Tonight, you're already closer than you think. Your body has found its position, maybe on your side, hand resting beneath the pillow, maybe on your back, eyes open in the dark. The room feels quieter now, not because the world stopped, but because your brain has begun turning its volume down. You are not asleep, but something inside you has already started leaving. There is a narrow space between waking and dreaming, a soft border you cross every night. And the strange thing is, the moment you cross it, you lose the ability to remember how. Somewhere in the final 7 minutes before sleep, your brain begins to reorganize itself. Waves slow, networks loosen, your sense of time stretches and thins, like fabric pulled gently in the dark. The mind that planned tomorrow, that replayed conversations, that carried the weight of the day, is quietly powering down, not all at once, but in layers. Tonight, we're going to remain in that space, right at the edge, and watch carefully as consciousness changes form. Welcome to deep science sleep, and to the 7 minutes you almost never notice. The threshold moment, what those last 7 minutes really are. Before we walk through each minute, we need to settle into the bigger picture. Because what we're talking about tonight isn't just falling asleep. That phrase makes it sound passive, like you're simply dropping, like a stone released from a hand. But what actually happens during the transition into sleep is one of the most complex, precisely choreographed biological transformations that occurs in the human body on a nightly basis. It is anything but passive. The scientific community refers to the sleep onset period, the transition from wakefulness into the first stage of sleep, as one of the most neurologically intricate windows in the entire sleep cycle. And interestingly, it's also one of the most understudied because it's so brief, so easy to miss, and so difficult to capture in the laboratory. When researchers want to study what the brain is doing during deep REM sleep, they can put subjects in an MRI machine and watch for hours. But the transition into sleep, that's a moving target, a threshold that slides, a moment that, by its very nature, vanishes at the instant it arrives. The last 7 minutes, roughly speaking, the minutes just before you cross into stage N1, the first stage of non-REM sleep, represent a gradual cascade of neurological changes. It is not a single event. It is a process, a slow unraveling, a dim down, a softening. And every minute of it tells a different story about what your brain is willing to let go of and what it holds on to until the very last. Now, let's be precise about the science for a moment because it matters. The word 7 minutes here isn't arbitrary. The average time for a healthy adult to fall asleep, what sleep scientists call sleep latency, typically ranges from about 10 to 20 minutes from the moment they lie down and close their eyes. The actual neurological transition, the window in which the brain is actively moving from wakefulness into the first stage of sleep, tends to compress into a much shorter period. Electroencephalogram studies, EEG studies, where electrodes placed on the scalp measure the electrical activity of the brain, have found that the transition from the alpha brainwaves of relaxed wakefulness to the theta brainwaves characteristic of stage N1 sleep can happen over a span of a few minutes. Sometimes as brief as 1 to 5 minutes, sometimes extended, sometimes accelerated. Our 7 minutes captures the outer edge of this transition period, beginning from when you're lying still in a relaxed, drowsy state and ending just as consciousness dissolves. And it's worth saying, the reason we're exploring this particular window is not just academic. Understanding what happens in these last moments before sleep is deeply relevant to how you experience your nights. People who struggle with insomnia often find this window stretched and painful. The minutes dragging, every sensation amplified, the mind too loud to let the body go. Understanding the neuroscience of this transition can reframe the experience, not as a performance you have to succeed at, but as a biological process that your brain already knows how to do. So let's begin at the beginning of the end. 7 minutes out. And let me tell you about the first thing that starts to change. The language. Not your spoken language, not yet. The language of your brain waves. Right now, if you were connected to an EEG machine, the electrodes would be picking up the dominant electrical rhythm of your cortex in a state of relaxed wakefulness with your eyes closed. That rhythm is called alpha. Alpha waves oscillate at roughly 8 to 12 cycles per second, 8 to 12 hertz in the technical notation. They are slow compared to the frenetic beta waves you produce when you're actively thinking, problem-solving, anxious, or engaged with the world. Beta waves run fast, above 13 hertz, sometimes much faster. When you're in a tense meeting, writing a difficult email, or arguing with someone, your brain is burning beta. But when you close your eyes and simply rest, not sleeping, just quiet, alpha takes over. Alpha is the wave of soft alertness, the rhythm of a mind that is present but not pushing. A musician who has set down her instrument but hasn't left the stage. A reader whose eyes have drifted from the page but whose attention hasn't quite wandered. Alpha is where you begin these 7 minutes. And what's about to happen over the next several minutes is a slow, beautiful, architecturally precise dissolution of that state, as alpha gives way to something slower, deeper, stranger. As your brain begins its nightly descent. The EEG recordings from hundreds of sleep studies tell us that this descent is not uniform across the brain. It doesn't happen all at once like a power cut. Different regions fall into the transition at different speeds. The occipital lobe, the visual processing regions at the back of the skull, tends to drop alpha activity earlier than other regions. The frontal cortex, the seat of planning, judgment, self-awareness, often holds on a little longer, as if the brain's executive command center is the last to turn the lights off, as if it needs a little extra convincing. And that is precisely what makes the last 7 minutes so rich to explore. Because in those minutes, different parts of you are falling asleep at different rates. Different aspects of your conscious experience are dimming in different sequences. You are not a light switch. You are something more like a great orchestra, each instrument quieting in its own time, playing its last notes until the hall is still. Let's follow the sequence. 7 minutes before sleep, the hall is still full of sound, but the conductor is already raising a hand. The waking mind begins to loosen. 7 minutes out. Your eyes are closed. Your breathing has already found a steadier rhythm than it had an hour ago. The tensions of the day, the things you said, the things you should have said, the list that loops are still there, but they're beginning to feel slightly less urgent, less sharp, like paper that's been left in the rain. Still legible, but softening at the edges. This feeling has a neurological explanation. What you're experiencing at minute 7 is the beginning of what neuroscientists call alpha dominance, the state where alpha brainwaves are accounting for more and more of your cortical electrical activity. Specifically, they're becoming prominent across the posterior regions of your brain, the parietal and occipital cortex, the regions that handle visual processing and spatial awareness. Alpha is the brain's resting rhythm. It represents a state where neurons are synchronized but not actively engaged with external input. Think of it as the hum of a well-maintained engine that is idling, not running hard, not turned off but quietly cycling. Now, here's something interesting. Alpha waves don't just appear because you're relaxed. They appear specifically when external visual input is removed. When you close your eyes, alpha rises. Open them, and alpha is blocked, suppressed by the influx of new visual data demanding to be processed. Close them again, and alpha returns. Sleep researchers sometimes describe alpha as the brain's default idle state in the absence of stimulation. So at minute 7, with eyes closed and the room dim and quiet, your cortex is producing this idle hum at full strength. But something else is happening alongside the alpha, and this is where it gets more interesting. Your prefrontal cortex, the region just behind your forehead, the most recently evolved part of the human brain, the part that gives you the capacity for complex reasoning, moral judgment, planning, and the continuous narration of selfhood, is beginning to relax its grip. Not fully, not yet, but the activity in the prefrontal cortex that characterizes waking cognition, the constant self-monitoring, the running assessment of where you are and what you're doing and whether it's okay, is beginning to soften. This matters enormously. The prefrontal cortex is, in a very real sense, the voice in your head. Not in a supernatural way, simply in the physiological sense that this region supports the continuous, language-like inner monologue that most adults experience as thinking. The plans, the worries, the self-evaluations, the mental rehearsals. At full waking strength, the prefrontal cortex is a relentless narrator. But as alpha rises and the input demands on the brain decrease, its metabolism begins to slow. The narrative begins to lose its tight structure. You might notice this as thoughts becoming slightly less sequential, less connected. One thought doesn't necessarily lead to the next with the logical crispness of your daytime mind. Associations become looser. A thought about something you need to do tomorrow might drift unexpectedly into a memory of a summer when you were 8, which dissolves into a vague visual impression that isn't quite memory and isn't quite imagination. This loosening is not a malfunction. It is the precise, purposeful beginning of a process your brain initiates every night. The tight constraints of waking cognition are deliberately relaxed. The brain that has been performing for the last 16 or 18 hours, interpreting sensory data, making predictions, constructing responses, maintaining a coherent model of reality and your place within it, is beginning to set down that extraordinary labor. At minute 7, the body is already cooperating. Heart rate has already begun its gradual nighttime decline. If you were wearing a pulse oximeter, you'd see your heart beating a little more slowly than it did an hour ago. Core body temperature, too, is on its way down, not dramatically but measurably. The blood vessels near the skin surface dilate slightly in the hours before sleep, releasing heat from the core of the body. This internal cooling is part of the circadian signal that primes the brain for sleep. As your core temperature drops by a fraction of a degree, the sleep pressure that has been building across the waking day, the accumulation of adenosine, the sleep-inducing chemical that builds up with every hour of wakefulness, begins to have full access to the receptors that will eventually pull you under. 7 minutes out, your body is doing everything right. The question is whether you'll let it. Because here is the thing about minute 7. It is also one of the most vulnerable minutes in the pre-sleep period. The mind is just loose enough that a stray thought, A sudden memory of something you forgot to do, a worry that resurfaces, the phantom ping of a phone, can snap you back to full alertness with startling ease. The alpha waves don't yet have the momentum to resist that kind of intrusion. Beta is always waiting in the wings, ready to reinstate itself the moment the brain detects something it deems relevant. This is why the environment matters so much at minute 7. Not just the obvious things, the darkness, the coolness of the room, but the emotional environment, the sense of safety, the felt certainty that there is nothing pressing to attend to. When the nervous system senses safety, it permits the alpha state to deepen. When it senses even subtle alertness cues, blue spectrum light, the sound of voices, the texture of unresolved conflict, it holds itself at the threshold, unable to proceed. But tonight, we're going to proceed. We're going to follow you into minute 6. And at minute 6, something remarkable is happening to the way you hear the world. Your senses start to close their gates. 6 minutes out. The room sounds different now than it did an hour ago. Not because anything has changed about the room. The same faint hum of the refrigerator, the same distant rumble of whatever is outside. But something in the way your brain is receiving those sounds has shifted. They feel further away, less urgent, like they're arriving from the other side of a glass wall. This is not your imagination. This is biology. And the system responsible for it has a name: sensory gating. And the part of the brain that performs it is one of the most underappreciated structures in the entire nervous system. The thalamus. The thalamus sits near the center of the brain, a small egg-shaped structure, and it serves as the primary relay station for nearly all sensory information on its way to the cerebral cortex. When you hear a sound, that sound travels up your auditory nerve, reaches the brainstem, and then, before it reaches your conscious awareness, it passes through the thalamus. The thalamus evaluates it, processes it, and forwards it up to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, where it becomes something you experience as a sound. During wakefulness, this system is essentially fully open. Almost all incoming sensory information passes through with high fidelity. The thalamus, in wakeful conditions, is a faithful and efficient relay. It takes in the signal from the ears and the eyes and the skin and passes it on to the cortex with minimal filtering. You are, in your waking hours, a highly sensitive sensory organism, capable of hearing a whisper across a room, noticing a movement in your peripheral vision, feeling the texture of a fabric between your fingers. But as the brain begins to transition towards sleep, the thalamus starts to receive a new set of instructions. Specifically, a structure that wraps around the thalamus like a thin shield, called the reticular thalamic nucleus, begins to increase its inhibitory activity. The reticular thalamic nucleus is composed primarily of inhibitory neurons, neurons that suppress the activity of other neurons. As sleep pressure increases and the brain's arousal systems begin to quiet, the reticular thalamic nucleus tightens its grip on the thalamus. It begins to slow down the relay, attenuate the signal, filter out the low-priority input. Research has measured this attenuation quantitatively. During drowsiness, that interim state between full wakefulness and sleep, the flow of sensory information reaching the cortex from the thalamus is estimated to be reduced to roughly 2/3 of what it is during full wakefulness. By the time you're in light non-REM sleep, stage N1, that fraction drops further still to approximately half or less of the original signal strength. Imagine a concert hall where every instrument is playing, and then one by one the amps are turned down. The strings go first, then the brass, and finally even the percussion seems to fade to a murmur. This is what your thalamus is doing to the incoming world at minute 6. It is not eliminating the sensory signal. It is dimming it, throttling it, reducing its urgency. And this is why, as you lie there on the edge of sleep, sounds that would have captured your attention during the day now float past you without anchoring. Car door closes outside. You register it distantly, but it doesn't pull you upright. It doesn't summon a response. Simply passes through. There's something important here that's often misunderstood about the sleeping brain. It doesn't go deaf, or blind, or numb. The sensory systems remain partially active through sleep. The thalamus continues to receive information, process it, and even pass some of it through to the cortex in attenuated form. What changes is the weight given to that information, the priority assigned to it. The brain develops a sophisticated discrimination system during sleep, a kind of relevance filter. Neutral sounds pass through without disruption, but a sound that carries personal significance, your name being called, a baby's cry, the sound of breaking glass, still has the power to wake you, because the brain doesn't simply go offline. It goes on standby with the alarm system still active. This is what sleep scientists call sensory gaining. The flip side of sensory gating. Sensory gating protects sleep by reducing the baseline signal. Sensory gaining protects the sleeper by ensuring that truly important signals still get through. Your brain sleeps with one ear still open, in the most literal neurological sense. But at minute 6, that gating process is in its early stages. The world is beginning to lose its grip on your attention. And at the same time, and this is something worth sitting with, you may begin to notice that your attention itself has become slightly diffuse. Not laser-focused as it might be when you're reading a difficult text. Not scattered as it might be when you're anxious, but soft, spread out, like light through frosted glass rather than through a lens. This diffusion of attention is related to the beginning of the alpha to theta transition. The theta brainwaves that characterize the early stages of sleep, oscillating at approximately 4 to 8 cycles per second, significantly slower than alpha, are beginning to ripple through the cortex. Not dominantly, not yet, but like the first notes of a quieter melody beginning to surface beneath the alpha hum that still defines the overall soundscape of your brain's electrical activity. The theta waves are associated with inward-directed attention, with the retrieval of emotionally salient memories, with the limbic system, the ancient emotional core of the brain, taking a more prominent role in shaping your conscious experience. And this is why, at minute 6, your thoughts might begin to turn inward, less outward toward planning and external tasks, more inward toward feeling, toward memory, toward fragments of experience that don't necessarily connect in any rational way. Something small from years ago might surface. A texture, a smell in memory, a voice, not summoned deliberately, not part of any plan, just rising, the way things rise to the surface of still water when you stop stirring it. This is normal. This is the system working as it should. And at minute 5, the system is going to start working on your body in a way you can feel very clearly. The body unlocks itself. 5 minutes out. If you pay attention right now, really pay attention with whatever residual focus remains, you can feel it, a heaviness, a settling, as if the weight of your body has increased by some invisible fraction, pressing you more firmly into the mattress. As if gravity has strengthened its claim on you. What you're feeling is not a trick of the mind. It is a direct consequence of something that is happening in your muscles, specifically in the electrical signals that your nervous system sends to those muscles. In waking life, your muscles are never truly at rest. This is not a choice. It's a continuous, automatic background process, orchestrated by the motor cortex and the descending pathways of the spinal cord. But as you approach sleep, that baseline begins to dissolve. Electromyography, EMG, the measurement of electrical activity in muscles, shows a clear pattern during the sleep onset period. Muscle activity decreases. The electrical signal from skeletal muscles, particularly the postural muscles of the neck and limbs, drops steadily as the brain transitions from wakefulness towards sleep. The motor system begins to relax its hold. The low-level vigilance contracts progressively. You feel this as the heaviness, the sinking, the sense that moving would require an effort that you're less and less interested in making. You might notice it first in your legs, a loosening in the muscles of the thighs, the calves, then in the arms, which feel faintly warm and dense, then in the hands, which may feel slightly disconnected from the usual sense of their own presence. Your fingers are there, you know they're there, but they feel further away than they did a few minutes ago. Less yours in some vague, unthreatening way. The physiological processes driving this are multiple and interrelated. The ventrolateral preoptic area of the hypothalamus, a small but critical sleep-promoting region in the brain, is increasing its activity. It releases inhibitory neurotransmitters, primarily GABA, which act on the arousal centers of the brainstem. The ascending arousal systems, the noradrenergic neurons of the locus coeruleus, the serotonergic neurons of the raphe nuclei, the histaminergic neurons of the tuberomammillary nucleus, all begin to have their activity suppressed. These are the systems that keep you awake. As they quiet down, the signal sent to the motor system decreases. There's also a hormone involved here worth mentioning. Melatonin, secreted by the pineal gland in response to darkness, and particularly in response to the absence of blue spectrum light, has been rising in your bloodstream for the last hour or two. Melatonin doesn't induce sleep directly. It doesn't knock you out. What it does is act as a biological signal, communicating to the brain and body that the circadian environment has shifted to nighttime. It coordinates the timing of the sleep onset. And among its effects is a contribution to the muscle relaxation process, reinforcing the quieting of the motor system, smoothing the descent into the physical stillness of sleep. At minute 5, you are becoming physically still in a way that feels organic and right. Not the forced stillness of lying rigidly in bed trying to sleep. The natural stillness of a body that is releasing something it's been holding all day. Now, here is where something peculiar begins to emerge from all this muscle relaxation. Because as the motor system quiets, the sensory feedback it generates also changes. The proprioceptive system, the system that tells your brain where your body is in space, what angle your joints are at, what forces are acting on your limbs, begins to receive quieter and more ambiguous signals. This matters because the brain, especially in these transitional minutes, doesn't always handle ambiguous proprioceptive input gracefully. Sometimes the brain misinterprets the fading proprioceptive signal as a loss of position, as falling, not dramatically, not with the terror of a conscious falling sensation, but a subtle, drifting, floating impression, as if the boundary between your body and the mattress has become slightly negotiable, as if gravity and solidity are less certain than they were. This is the feeling that many people describe in the early sleep onset period, a floating sensation, a vague sense of motion in stillness. Some people find it mildly disconcerting. Others find it profoundly peaceful. It depends, often, on how much anxiety accompanies the transition. For a nervous system that has learned to associate this state with danger, this floating sensation can trigger a return to alertness. For a nervous system that trusts the process, it is simply part of the passage. And sometimes, at minute 5, this proprioceptive ambiguity will produce something more dramatic, something we're going to discuss in detail a little later in this journey. The hypnic jerk, the sudden, full-body startle that catches so many people by surprise just as they're drifting off. But we're not quite there yet. First, let's cross from minute 5 into minute 4. Because at minute 4, something extraordinary begins to happen in the space behind your eyes. The hypnagogic borderland opens. For minutes out, close your eyes now, or rather keep them closed because they probably already are. And notice what you see. Not nothing, not simple darkness, something else. A faint luminosity that shifts, perhaps a texture. A subtle granularity to the blackness, like static on an old television screen, but softer, more organic. Perhaps a shape that forms and dissolves before you can quite name it. A spiral, a color that blooms and fades. A landscape that's almost there, almost a landscape, before it shifts again into something else entirely. You are at the edge of one of the most fascinating states that the human brain can occupy. This is the beginning of hypnagogia. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek, hypnos, meaning sleep, and agoagos, meaning conductor or leader, a conductor of sleep. Alfred Maury introduced the term in 1848, though the experience it describes has been documented since antiquity, in the writings of Aristotle, in the mystical texts of Iamblichus, in the journals of countless artists, philosophers, and scientists across the centuries. Because hypnagogia, it turns out, is not just a quirk of the drowsy brain. It is something more remarkable. It is a creative hot zone. A state of mind that some of history's most original thinkers have deliberately cultivated and exploited. But let's stay with the science first. Hypnagogia is the transitional state of consciousness that occupies the transition from wakefulness to sleep, specifically the period associated with stage N1 NREM sleep, the very first stage of sleep. During this state, the brain's electrical signature undergoes a signature shift, the alpha waves of relaxed wakefulness. Those steady 8 to 12 Hz rhythms begin to give way increasingly to theta waves. Theta oscillates at roughly 4 to 8 Hz, slower, more expansive, less precise. On an EEG recording, the sleep onset is often defined precisely by this transition. When alpha wave activity drops below 50% of the total brainwave activity in any given moment, and theta begins to dominate, you have crossed from wakefulness into stage N1. The disappearance of alpha is considered by many sleep researchers to be the official marker of sleep onset. It's the neurological line that divides being awake from being asleep. But what's remarkable about minute 4 is that you are not yet fully across that line. You are straddling it. You are in what researchers sometimes call threshold consciousness, a state of mind that is neither fully awake nor fully asleep, but genuinely both at once. Alpha and theta are co-present, cohabiting the cortex, competing in a gentle way for dominance. And it is precisely this cohabitation that creates the hypnagogic experience. Because during this phase, the brain's normal filtering systems, the systems that rigorously separate internal from external, real from imagined, memory from perception, are still partially active but are no longer operating at full efficiency. The prefrontal cortex, which normally applies a strict critical scrutiny to the contents of experience, has stepped back. The thalamus is no longer faithfully forwarding the external sensory world. And in that space, that loosening of constraints, the brain begins to generate its own content. And the content can be extraordinary. The most commonly reported hypnagogic experience involves visual phenomena. Approximately 86% of people who report hypnagogic experiences describe seeing something, not with their eyes, but in the closed-eye visual field. These images run a wide range: simple geometric forms, dots of light, abstract color patterns, but also more complex imagery, faces, landscapes, figures, scenes that feel almost but not quite like dreams. The key characteristic that distinguishes hypnagogic imagery from full dreams is its typically static or fragmentary nature. A single image that persists for a moment before dissolving. A face that is there and then gone. A room that almost coheres before it dissolves back into abstract color. These images are not hallucinations in the clinical sense. They are the product of the brain's visual processing regions, the occipital cortex, the fusiform face area, the parahippocampal place area, becoming spontaneously active as the inhibition of external input creates a kind of receptive blank canvas. Research using fMRI imaging has found that when people report seeing faces in the hypnagogic state, the fusiform face area, the brain region specialized for face processing, shows measurable activation. The brain, deprived of external faces to process, is generating its own. Now, about those famous thinkers. Thomas Edison, the American inventor, was notorious for his use of hypnagogia as a creative tool. He would nap in his laboratory chair, holding steel ball bearings in his hands. As he drifted towards sleep and his grip relaxed, the balls would fall to the metal floor, the clatter would wake him, and he would immediately record whatever was in his mind. He did this deliberately and repeatedly, convinced that the hypnagogic state generated his best ideas. Salvador Dali, the surrealist painter, did something similar with a key held over a plate. He called it slumber with a key and credited the imagery he captured in those half-sleeping moments with some of the most distinctive imagery in his paintings. The melting clocks, the strange anatomies, the landscapes that feel real and impossible at the same time. These are, in some sense, hypnagogic visions translated onto canvas. Nikola Tesla reportedly experienced vivid hypnagogic imagery regularly. Niels Bohr, the physicist who developed the early model of the atom, credited a hypnagogic vision, seeing the nucleus of the atom with electrons spinning around it like planets around the sun, as the moment of insight that shaped his Nobel Prize-winning theoretical work. Paul McCartney, in early 1965, woke from sleep with a complete melody in his head. He rushed to the piano to transcribe it before it faded. He was so convinced he had unconsciously plagiarized someone else's composition that he spent weeks asking musicians if they recognized it. Nobody did. The melody was Yesterday, and it had arrived in the hypnagogic state. A 2021 study from the Paris Brain Institute found formal experimental evidence for what these anecdotal accounts suggest. Researchers presented participants with a math problem that contained a hidden rule. One that, if discovered, would allow the problem to be solved much faster. Participants were then given a rest period and monitored with EEG. Of those who remained fully awake during the rest period, about 30% discovered the hidden rule. Of those who drifted into deeper sleep, only about 14% did. But of those who spent time in the hypnagogic state, stage N1, the early theta-dominant transition, an extraordinary 83% discovered the rule upon waking. 3 times more likely to find creative insight, simply by spending time in this borderland between waking and sleep. The reason, researchers believe, lies in the loosening of the prefrontal cortex's gatekeeping function. In full waking cognition, the prefrontal cortex imposes a kind of logical discipline on thought. It suppresses remote and seemingly irrelevant associations in favor of direct, task-focused processing. This is enormously useful for most cognitive tasks. But it can also prevent the kind of distant, nonlinear connection-making that characterizes creative insight. The hypnagogic state, by temporarily stepping back the prefrontal cortex while allowing the associative memory networks of the hippocampus and the limbic system to remain active, creates a brain that is looser, more playful, more willing to entertain the unlikely connection. It is a brain, in short, that is briefly free of itself. And you're in it right now, a minute 4. In this in-between, the images at the edge of your closed-eye vision, the thoughts that don't quite cohere, the memories that arise unbidden, the fragments of scenes that feel vaguely familiar even when they're made of things that never happened. This is your brain in its most creatively open state, and it's about to do something even stranger to your sense of where you are in time. Time loses its shape. 3 minutes out. Think about when you last checked the time. How long ago does it seem? If you've been lying in bed for the last several minutes, drifting towards sleep, and someone asked you right now, before asking without thinking, you might find that you genuinely don't know. Was it 3 minutes? 10? The clock-watching certainty of your daytime mind has already loosened. Time has become approximate. This is not a small thing. This is one of the most interesting phenomena in the entire sleep onset sequence. And it has a neuroscience behind it that's worth exploring slowly. In waking life, your sense of time, your ability to judge duration, to track the passage of minutes, depends on a network of brain regions that includes the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. This network functions something like an internal pacemaker, counting off regular beats of experience against a running total. When you're engaged and alert, this pacemaker runs with reasonable accuracy. More or less how long you've been waiting, how much time has passed since you sat down, how many minutes remain until something you're expecting. But the pacemaker is an active system. It requires attention. It requires a certain level of cortical arousal to function accurately. And at minute 3, that arousal is declining. The attention that feeds the timekeeping system is spreading thin, diffusing, losing its grip. The result is that time perception begins to stretch. This is a well-established phenomenon in sleep research. The sleep onset period is one in which subjective time estimation becomes profoundly unreliable. Studies have found that people lying in bed trying to fall asleep consistently and significantly overestimate how much time has passed. A person who has been lying awake for 15 minutes may feel they've been awake for 45. A person who has been drifting in the hypnagogic state for 5 minutes may feel that half an hour has floated by, or, conversely, may be shocked to discover that 20 minutes have passed when it seemed like only moments. The direction of this distortion depends on the state of the nervous system. If the brain is anxious and hyper-aroused, monitoring itself, counting the seconds, alert to every moment of wakefulness as evidence of insomnia, it tends to overestimate elapsed time. The very act of monitoring creates more perceived events, more counts on the internal pacemaker, inflating the experience of duration. This is why insomnia so often feels catastrophically longer than it actually is. But when the nervous system is genuinely relaxing, when the monitoring has stopped, when the prefrontal cortex has loosened its grip, when you're actually in the early stages of the hypnagogic state rather than fighting it, time can perform the opposite trick, can compress, can vanish. You can drift for what feels like seconds and discover you've been asleep for 20 minutes. At minute 3, your nervous system has, hopefully, crossed the line from anxious monitoring into genuine relaxation. And if it has, the sensation of time has become something more like water than a ruler. It holds shape only loosely. It's still there, still passing, but it's no longer counting itself out with any precision. This temporal loosening is connected to another aspect of the theta state that's worth understanding. Theta waves, as we've mentioned, are associated with the hippocampus and the limbic system. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped structure buried in the medial temporal lobe, is one of the brain's key systems for episodic memory and, interestingly, for the tagging of experiences with temporal context. When you remember an event and locate it in time, that was 3 years ago, that happened on a Tuesday. The hippocampus is centrally involved in that temporal placement. As theta waves begin to dominate and the hippocampus shifts into a different operational mode, one more associated with memory consolidation and associative retrieval than with active temporal monitoring, the continuous updating of your location in clock time begins to slip. The brain no longer asks, "What time is it?" with any great urgency. It's beginning to care about something else, something more interior. There's a philosopher's observation buried in all of this. The ancient Greeks had 2 words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos was clock time, the measured, sequential, quantifiable march of seconds and minutes. Kairos was a different kind of time, the time of the right moment of experience, of meaning, the qualitative dimension of time rather than the quantitative. In waking life, most of us spend the vast majority of our time experience in chronos. We are clock people, schedule people, meeting time and deadline time and how many minutes until people. But in the hypnagogic state, at minute 3, as the prefrontal monitoring decreases and the limbic system becomes more prominent, something like kairos begins to resurface. Time becomes experiential rather than measured. It becomes felt rather than counted. And in the felt time of minute 3, a minute can be an ocean, or it can be a breath. Somewhere in this loosening of temporal certainty, the boundary between remembering and imagining also begins to blur. A memory might arise not as a clearly labeled "this happened," but simply as a scene, a presence, a sensation. You might find yourself somewhere you've been before without being sure whether you're remembering it or dreaming it. Without being sure there's a difference. This is the first real sign that your conscious mind is approaching something it cannot fully observe, the threshold of sleep. And just as you're settling into this timeless loosening, your body is about to issue its most dramatic announcement of the night. The hypnic jerk and the ancient reflex. 2 minutes out. You've been here before. The body suddenly lurches. A sharp, involuntary contraction, the legs, the arms, sometimes the whole body, that jolts you awake from the very edge of sleep. The heart races briefly. There's a disorienting half-second of confusion. Where were you? What happened? Are you falling? And then, nothing. You're fine. In bed. Almost asleep. The disturbance fades as quickly as it came. If you've experienced this, and you almost certainly have, since research suggests that somewhere between 60 and 70% of people experience it, you've encountered one of the most discussed yet still incompletely understood phenomena in sleep science. The hypnic jerk, also known as the hypnagogic jerk, a sleep start, predormital myoclonus, a term that simply means an involuntary muscle twitch that occurs before sleep. Whatever you call it, it's one of the most vivid and physically unmistakable events in the entire sleep onset sequence. And it occurs, characteristically, right here in the last 2 minutes before sleep, during the deepening of the hypnagogic state. What causes it? The honest answer is that the scientific community has not yet converged on a single definitive explanation. But there are several well-supported theories, and they're fascinating in different ways. The first and most widely cited theory focuses on the transition between two different operational modes in the nervous system. During wakefulness, the motor system is active and coordinated. It responds to voluntary commands and maintains continuous, precise control of the body. As the brain transitions to sleep, the motor system begins to receive a very different kind of signal, an inhibitory one. The brainstem and higher motor centers begin to progressively reduce the excitatory drive to the muscles. This is the process that will eventually, in deep sleep and REM sleep, produce complete muscle atonia, the full relaxation of the skeletal muscles. But this transition is not always smooth. Many researchers believe that the hypnic jerk represents what happens when the nervous system goes through a momentary miscommunication during this handoff, a misfire. As some scientists describe it, originating from the reticular activating system in the brainstem. As the descending inhibitory signals increase, occasionally a burst of aberrant excitatory activity slips through, producing a sudden, brief, and entirely involuntary contraction of the limb muscles. Think of it as the nervous system's equivalent of a dropped connection. For a fraction of a second, the signal pathway stutters, and the motor neurons that were supposed to receive a stand-down instruction instead receive a burst of excitation. The result is a jerk, a startle, a momentary reactivation of a body that was in the process of powering down. The second theory, more evolutionary, more speculative, but widely popularized, connects the hypnic jerk to the ancestral past of our species. The hypothesis goes like this: before humans were Homo sapiens sleeping in beds in weatherproof buildings, our primate ancestors slept in trees. And falling asleep in a tree is a particularly risky proposition, because the deepening of muscle relaxation that characterizes sleep onset would naturally cause a sleeping primate to begin to lose its grip on the branch. The progressive motor inhibition of sleep, in other words, would be physiologically indistinguishable from the beginning of a fall. The theory proposes that the hypnic jerk is an ancient protective reflex, a last-check behavior from the brainstem that, as the muscles relax and proprioceptive signals become ambiguous, interprets the situation as possible falling and fires a compensatory muscle contraction to catch the body. A remnant of a time when you needed to wake up and grab the branch before you were fully gone. The brain, according to this theory, mistakes the progressive relaxation of muscle tone for the beginning of a fall. And it responds the way a fall prevention system responds, with a sudden whole-body catch. We can't know for certain whether this evolutionary account is accurate. It's difficult to test. But what we do know is that the hypnic jerk occurs at precisely the moment in the sleep onset sequence when muscle relaxation is most actively progressing and when proprioceptive ambiguity is at its height. It occurs, in other words, exactly when the brain might be most likely to misinterpret what the body is doing. There's also a third consideration that helps explain why hypnic jerks are more frequent on some nights than others. The reticular activating system, the brainstem network that modulates arousal, wakefulness, and the transition between states, is more likely to produce misfires when it is already overactivated. When you are sleep-deprived, highly stressed, caffeinated, or physically exhausted, the reticular system is running hot. And a hot reticular system trying to wind down through a sleep onset transition is more likely to stutter. This is why you're more likely to experience intense, repeated hypnic jerks on nights when you've pushed too long and too hard, when the body is desperate for sleep but the nervous system hasn't had time to properly taper down from its daytime state. The experiential quality of the hypnic jerk is worth pausing on, because it varies considerably from person to person and from episode to episode. Many people experience a sensation of falling, a vivid, brief impression of having missed a step, gone over an edge. Some people see a flash of light. Some hear a loud sound that isn't there. Some experience a very brief hypnagogic hallucination, a fractional dream image, preceding the jerk, as if the hypnagogic state briefly generated a scenario to accompany the falling sensation. A stumble on a stair, a misstep on the street, a sensation of slipping off something, and then it's over and you're back, heart beating a little faster, eyes perhaps briefly open, and then closed again. The hypnic jerk is, for most people, a minor thing, an inconvenience, occasionally startling, sometimes enough to wake a bed partner, but fundamentally harmless, physiologically normal, something that approximately 70% of people experience at some point, with roughly 10% experiencing it on a nightly basis. What's striking about it, in the context of this journey we're taking through the last 7 minutes, is what it represents. The nervous system in the process of renegotiating the rules, in the process of transitioning from the wakefulness protocols in which motor control is precise, proprioception is accurate, and the body is vigilantly maintained, to the sleep protocols in which the motor system is progressively handed over to a different mode of regulation. The hypnic jerk is what happens at the seam of that transition. It is the last significant twitch of the waking motor system before it surrenders to something deeper. After the hypnic jerk, if it comes, the body usually settles deeply. The muscles, having twitched, release into an even heavier stillness. The heart rate, briefly elevated, drops back toward its resting pace. And the mind, briefly startled back to the threshold, hovers for a moment before beginning its final descent. 1 minute now, 1 minute from sleep. And something very deep is happening inside the brain. The default mode network goes dark. 1 minute out, you are almost gone. The distinction between what you're thinking and what you're imagining has mostly dissolved. The story you were telling yourself about the day, the mental narrative that runs almost constantly in waking life, the inner commentary, the retrospective and prospective self-assessments, that story has lost its coherence. It no longer has a point. It no longer has a direction. It's become something more like weather, present, diffuse, no longer organized around any particular subject or task. This is one of the most significant events in the entire pre-sleep sequence, the quieting of the default mode network. Let's spend some time here because this is genuinely one of the most important discoveries in modern cognitive neuroscience, and it's deeply relevant to what you're experiencing right now. The default mode network, DMN, as it's typically abbreviated, is a constellation of interconnected brain regions that show increased activity when you are not focused on an external task. The network includes, most prominently, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, and parts of the angular gyrus and the lateral temporal cortex. These are all regions involved in introspection, self-referential thought, mental time travel. The capacity to mentally project yourself into the past and the future, and theory of mind, the ability to model the mental states of others. The default mode network is, in a very real sense, the network of the self. It's most active when you're daydreaming, when you're reminiscing, when you're planning, imagining possible futures, when you're thinking about what someone else must be thinking or feeling, when you're ruminating on who you are and what you've done and what it means. The DMN is the brain's autobiographical narrator. Its inner voice, the continuous, self-generating story of you. Neurologist Marcus Raichle, who is widely credited with formalizing the concept of the default mode network in the early 2000s, coined the term default mode because he noticed that this network is what the brain defaults to, what it reverts to in the absence of focused external demand. When you're not doing anything in particular, the default mode network fires up. It is the brain's resting state, but it's a deeply active resting state, not an idle one. The DMN uses significant metabolic resources. It is working hard when you think you're doing nothing. And during the sleep onset period, this network begins to change. Studies using functional MRI have tracked the activity of the default mode network as people transition from wakefulness into sleep. The findings are striking. The coordinated activity within the DMN, the tight functional coupling between its various nodes, the synchronized pattern of activation that characterizes its waking operation, begins to reduce during the sleep onset transition. Specifically, the frontal components of the DMN, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex, show some of the earliest signs of decreased involvement. The self-referential processing system, the part that keeps asking, "What does this mean for me?" begins to step back. What replaces it is a kind of internal quietness that is difficult to describe in language, precisely because language itself is a product of the waking DMN. But people who have been awakened from the very early stages of sleep, stage N1, right at the threshold, and asked to describe their mental state before waking often use words like diffuse, floating, fragmentary, dreamlike, not quite thinking. Not the tight narrative cohesion of wakeful thought. Something looser, more visual, more sensory and less verbal. This is the DMN in the process of releasing its grip. And what fills the space as it lets go is not emptiness. It is something more like a gentle hum of association, the limbic system's emotional landscape becoming more prominent as the prefrontal filter decreases, the hippocampus generating fragments of memory and imagined experience without the organizational structure that wakeful cognition imposes. The brain is not switching off. It is switching modes. Think about it this way. The waking DMN is like a busy editorial office, constantly receiving material, applying judgment, constructing a coherent narrative from the fragments that arrive. Every experience is processed through this editorial lens. What does it mean? What does it say about me? What should I do about it? How does it fit into the story? The sleep onset transition turns this editorial voice down, and what remains is more like raw material, unprocessed, unnarrativized, just experience, floating free of interpretation. In the very last seconds of waking consciousness, a minute out and counting, the quality of this internal state becomes something that no amount of verbal description quite captures. It's why so many writers and philosophers and mystics across history have tried to articulate the borderland of sleep and found their words insufficient. Because what happens at the edge of consciousness is by definition something that the conscious mind, organized around language and narrative and self-reference, cannot fully observe without disturbing. The moment you truly notice that you're on the edge of sleep, you've already stepped back from it. This is the fundamental paradox of the sleep onset threshold. Consciousness cannot observe its own dissolution without reinstating itself. But the dissolution happens anyway, and it is profound. There's a term in philosophy that might help here: apophasis, the description of something by saying what it is not, because what it is resists positive characterization. What happens in the last seconds before sleep is something like apophatic experience. The self that is falling asleep is not thinking in the usual way. It is not perceiving in the usual way. It is not located in time in the usual way. It is not narrating itself in the usual way. And yet it is not absent. Something is still there at the threshold. Some residual awareness, some thin thread of witnessing. Some quality of experience that is neither wakeful nor dreaming, but genuinely between. Neuroscientists sometimes call this threshold consciousness. It is the experience of the brain's consciousness systems in the process of reconfiguring themselves, not yet in the new configuration of sleep, still faintly in the outgoing configuration of wakefulness. Some traditions of meditation, particularly certain forms of Tibetan Buddhist practice, specifically target this threshold state. The instructions often involve attempting to remain aware during sleep onset, to observe the unraveling of waking consciousness from within it, to witness the moment of dissolution with as much equanimity and clarity as possible. It's considered an advanced practice, partly because of the fundamental paradox already mentioned. Any effort to observe tends to re-engage the waking mind and push the threshold away. But whether or not you're meditating right now, 1 minute from sleep, you're in this state. And it is extraordinary. The electrical activity of your brain, measured at this moment by EEG, would show an almost complete dominance of theta waves. That slow, 4 to 8 Hz rhythm, rolling softly through the cortex like slow ocean swells. The alpha of your relaxed wakefulness has mostly receded. The beta of active thinking has long since gone quiet. Theta is dominant, and in its slow roll, the brain is doing something it is deeply, beautifully evolved to do. It is letting go, slowly, in waves, the way a tide withdraws from a beach, not all at once, but in a long, gradual retreat that leaves the sand wet and glistening in the quiet that follows. 10 seconds, 20, 30, the crossing, the last moment before sleep. No one knows exactly where it is. There is no clean line, no bell that rings, no darkness that descends from above like a curtain. What there is instead is a gradual transition, a deepening of everything we've been describing, until the final criterion for sleep is met. The moment when alpha waves no longer compose the majority of the brain's electrical activity. When theta is no longer competing with alpha but has simply replaced it. When the slow rolling waves are all there are. This is stage N1, the official beginning of sleep. Stage N1 is the most misunderstood stage in the entire sleep cycle, precisely because of its placement at the threshold. It's a transitional stage, typically lasting only 1 to 7 minutes for healthy adults before the brain descends into the deeper stage N2. It's also a stage in which most people, if awakened, will report that they weren't asleep at all. This is one of the most consistent and fascinating findings in sleep research. People in stage N1, as measured by EEG, frequently deny having been asleep when awakened. They say they were just thinking, just resting, just lying there. This mismatch between objective sleep stage and subjective waking experience is called sleep state misperception, and it's particularly pronounced in people with insomnia. For a person who chronically believes they cannot sleep, the hours they spend in stage N1 and even early stage N2 may be experienced as wakefulness. Because the machinery of subjective awareness, which normally updates our sense of "I was asleep" during the crossing of this threshold, doesn't always function reliably at the border. But the EEG doesn't lie. The theta waves are dominant. The slow rolling eye movements, called slow eye movements or SEMs, which appear early in stage N1 and are quite different from the rapid eye movements of REM sleep, are present. The EMG shows a significant reduction in muscle activity. Sleep, by every objective physiological measure, has begun. And something else has happened in the brain at this moment that is quiet and gentle and rarely noted in the popular literature around sleep. The sensory feedback loops have begun to lose their coherence in a very specific way. In wakefulness, the brain operates through tight, rapid feedback between sensory input, cortical processing, and the reevaluation of that processing. You hear a sound, the thalamus processes it, the auditory cortex receives it, the prefrontal cortex evaluates it, and a response, even if only a mental one, is generated and fed back. This loop is fast, coherent, and continuous during wakefulness. It creates the seamless, updated sense of present experience. As stage N1 deepens, this loop begins to lose its speed and its tight coupling. The time delays within the feedback system increase slightly. The reevaluation step. The prefrontal, is this important? Gate has reduced activity. The loop is still there, but it's slower, less responsive. And in the loosening of that responsiveness, experience begins to acquire the quality we most associate with dreams, the quality of spontaneity, of uncontrolled unfolding, of images and sounds and sensations that arise without being summoned. This is why the hypnagogic imagery of these last seconds can have such a vivid, involuntary quality. It is not quite a dream. Not yet. Dreams, in their full narrative complexity, occur primarily in REM sleep, which won't arrive until much later in the night, typically after 90 to 120 minutes of NREM sleep. But these threshold images, the faces that form in the dark behind your closed eyes, the scenes that almost cohere, the sounds that almost make words, these are the first drafts. The early sketches, the brain's imagery system coming online in a new mode. The hippocampus, deeply active in theta rhythm, is weaving memory fragments into these early images. The emotional brain is adding its coloration, familiar feelings, half-recognized places, faces of people who mean something. The cortex is receiving these contributions without the organizing hand of the prefrontal cortex to impose a narrative. The result is an experience that is simultaneously intensely personal and strangely arbitrary. Your images, your emotional tones, but no plot, no agenda, no you holding it all together. You are asleep, or near enough that the distinction has dissolved. The breathing has slowed to its sleep rhythm, long, even effortless. The chest rises and falls with a regularity that in wakefulness requires conscious effort to achieve, but in sleep arrives on its own. The brainstem's automatic respiratory rhythm asserting itself now that the higher cortical influences have quieted. The heart, too, has found its nighttime pace, slower, more even. The blood pressure has begun its nocturnal dip. The body is doing what it needs to do, and the brain is doing something remarkable, something it will continue to do for the next 7 or 8 hours, cycling through stages of NREM and REM sleep in a repeating architecture that serves functions we are still, after decades of research, only beginning to fully understand. Memory consolidation, emotional processing, metabolic restoration, synaptic maintenance, the clearing of neurotoxic waste products through the glymphatic system, the brain's cleanup machinery that operates most efficiently during deep sleep, the rehearsal of skills, the integration of new learning with old knowledge. None of that is available to the waking mind. All of it requires the threshold to be crossed. The threshold you just crossed. Extended reflection. The extraordinary ordinariness of falling asleep. Let's stay here for a moment, because there's something worth dwelling on, now that we've traced the journey from minute 7 to minute 0. Something about the sheer improbability of what just happened, and what happens every single night to every sleeping human being on Earth. Consider what had to occur in those last 7 minutes. The entire edifice of waking consciousness, the self-monitoring, the sensory engagement with the world, the continuous narrative of selfhood, the precise motor control of the body, the accurate perception of time, the tight feedback loops that create the moment-to-moment experience of being present and aware, all of that had to be progressively, deliberately, systematically dismantled. Piece by piece, system by system, in a precise sequence that has been refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary pressure. And then, in 7 or 8 hours, it will be rebuilt. Just as systematically, just as precisely, the alpha waves of waking will reemerge. The sensory gates of the thalamus will open again. The motor system will come back online. The default mode network will reinstate its narrative. And you will, once more, be fully, consciously, temporally located in the world. This is not a small thing that happens to you every night. This is a masterwork of biological engineering, arguably one of the most complex and remarkable things any physical system in the known universe does on a regular basis. And the fact that you mostly do it without thinking, that it seems ordinary, that you complain when it doesn't work perfectly and take for granted the thousands of nights when it does. Well, that's understandable. The most profound processes are often the ones that feel most familiar. There's a beautiful irony at the heart of sleep science. The more we learn about what happens in the transition to sleep, the more precisely we can map the EEG signatures, the neurotransmitter cascades, the thalamocortical dynamics, the shifts in the default mode network, the more extraordinary the ordinary experience of lying down and closing your eyes becomes. Every night, something in you knows how to do this, has always known. You were doing it before you had language to describe it, before you had curiosity to ask about it. Your nervous system carries the ancient instructions in every neuron, in the chemical gradients across every synaptic membrane. Sleep is not something you have to figure out. It is something your body already deeply, precisely, exquisitely knows. And the 7 minutes before it? Those are not wasted time, not dead space between waking and sleeping. They are a passage, a transformation, one of the most intimate and scientifically fascinating experiences available to the human brain. Tonight, you made it. The science continues. What happens after you cross? We've focused on the threshold, but it's worth briefly tracing what happens after the crossing, because stage N1 is only the beginning. What unfolds over the course of a full night of sleep is an architecture of remarkable complexity and beauty. From stage N1, the healthy brain descends into stage N2. The EEG in stage N2 is still dominated by theta waves, but two new phenomena appear: sleep spindles and K-complexes. Sleep spindles are bursts of rapid oscillatory activity, 12 to 16 hertz, that appear for about half a second to 2 seconds and then fade. They are generated by circuits in the thalamus and the cortex, and they're thought to play an important role in the consolidation of procedural and declarative memories, the learning of motor skills and factual information. The brain, in stage N2, is beginning the work of organizing and storing the day's experience. K-complexes are different, sharp, high-voltage waves that appear spontaneously or in response to external sounds. They're considered the most significant individual event in the healthy EEG. They represent the brain's response to environmental input during sleep, a kind of brief awakening of cortical processing that doesn't rise to full consciousness but nonetheless registers that something happened. After stage N2, the brain descends further into stage N3, slow-wave sleep, also called deep sleep, the stage that is so crucial to physical restoration and immune function. The EEG here is dominated by delta waves, the slowest of all the sleep rhythms, under 4 Hz, high amplitude, rolling like continental shelves through the cortex. This is the sleep that is hardest to wake from, the sleep after which you feel most groggy if disrupted. The sleep that the body prioritizes when sleep-deprived, making up for lost slow-wave time before making up for lost REM. And then, after approximately 90 minutes of NREM sleep, the first REM period arrives. The EEG suddenly shifts to a pattern that looks very much like wakefulness. Fast, desynchronized, low-amplitude activity. The eyes, behind closed lids, begin their characteristic rapid movements. And the motor system, in a final elegant arrangement, is actively inhibited by the brainstem, GABA and glycin flooding the motor neurons of the spinal cord and brainstem, producing the muscle atonia that keeps you still while your dreaming brain generates experience as vivid and emotionally charged as anything you encounter while awake. This is the cycle that repeats approximately every 90 to 110 minutes throughout the night. NREM descending, slow wave, NREM ascending, and then REM. The first REM period is usually brief, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes. The later periods grow longer as the night progresses. By the last cycle before waking, REM can occupy 45 to 60 minutes. This architecture is not arbitrary. The timing, the sequencing, the progressive weighting toward REM in the later hours of the night, all of it serves specific neurological functions that the field is continuing to uncover. And it all begins with those 7 minutes. That threshold crossing, that slow dissolution of the waking brain into the sleeping one. A note on what this means for you. This is not just beautiful science for its own sake. Understanding what happens in the last 7 minutes before sleep has practical implications for how you approach the experience of lying down at night. The brain's transition to sleep requires a specific set of conditions. Not just the obvious ones, darkness, an appropriate temperature, a quiet environment, but also internal conditions. A nervous system that is not hypervigilant. a prefrontal cortex that is not running its monitoring routines at full intensity, a sense of safety that allows the thalamus to begin its gating work, that allows the motor system to begin releasing its vigilance, that allows the DMN to start its slow, graceful quieting. When we understand this, we can see that struggling towards sleep, performing sleep, trying to make sleep happen through effort is neurologically self-defeating. The transition to sleep requires the opposite of effort. It requires a particular quality of surrender that the nervous system will find on its own if given the right conditions. It requires trusting the process that has been running since long before you were born. The alpha waves know what to do. The thalamus knows what to do. The reticular activating system knows when to step down. The motor neurons know when to release. The default mode network knows eventually how to let the narrative go. Your only job in those 7 minutes is to not interfere, to lie in the darkness and breathe, and allow the ancient and extraordinarily sophisticated machinery of your nervous system to do what it was designed to do. It will get there. It always does. The hypnagogic state and creative practice. A closing meditation. Before we leave these 7 minutes entirely, there's one more dimension worth exploring. The potential that lives in the threshold itself. We talked about Edison and Dali and McCartney and Bohr. We talked about the Paris Brain Institute study showing that the hypnagogic state triples the likelihood of discovering hidden patterns. But there's something broader here, something that applies not just to geniuses with steel balls in their hands, but to all of us. The hypnagogic state is a window in which the ordinary rules of cognition relax, in which the tight, goal-directed, self-critical logic of the prefrontal cortex steps back, and the associative, emotional, imaginative systems of the brain are given temporary prominence. This creates a mental space that is unusually receptive to connection-making, to finding links between ideas that in full waking cognition would never be placed near each other. Every person who has lain in bed and found that the solution to a problem they'd been wrestling with all day suddenly presented itself, clearly, effortlessly, almost as if delivered, has experienced this. The mathematician whose proof crystallizes. The writer whose stuck chapter suddenly unlocks. The musician who hears the chord sequence they'd been searching for. The engineer who sees the design flaw they'd been missing. These moments are not luck. They are neuroscience. They are the hypnagogic state doing what it naturally does, loosening the constraints of waking cognition and allowing the brain's deeper, associative intelligence to surface. You can cultivate this deliberately, not by fighting sleep, but by arriving at the threshold with a gentle, specific intention. A question held lightly in mind as the alpha begins to soften. A problem set before the hypnagogic imagery like a film at a projector. And then, crucially, letting go of the need to control the answer, simply allowing the threshold state to work on it. And then, upon surfacing from sleep or from a brief hypnagogic rest, immediately, before the prefrontal cortex reasserts its editorial control, recording whatever is there. Whatever fragment, whatever image, whatever connection. Before it fades. Before the waking mind decides it's irrelevant. This is what Edison was doing with his steel balls. This is what Dali was doing with his key. This is what every person who keeps a notebook by their bed is, knowingly or not, attempting to practice. The harvest of the threshold. You've been lying at the threshold all this time. The fruit, if there is any, is available to you. The soft landing. Let's end here. Somewhere between 6 and 7 hours from now, you'll wake up. The alarm or the light, or simply the natural reassertion of the waking brain's rhythms will call you back from wherever sleep has taken you. You'll surface, probably through a period of hypnopompia, the transition from sleep back to wakefulness, which mirrors the hypnagogic state in reverse, and you'll re-enter your life. And you'll carry with you always the quiet fact that you've spent roughly a third of your entire life in this other state, this alternative mode of being, this dark country of the brain where consciousness dissolves and is rebuilt night after night across the entirety of a human life. It's worth knowing a little about where you go. It's worth knowing that the place is not empty, not silent, that your brain, while you sleep, is working with a dedication and a complexity that would astonish you if you could observe it. That the last 7 minutes before sleep are not just prelude, they are transformation. A nightly metamorphosis that occurs so smoothly, so automatically, so naturally, that it takes the full weight of neuroscience to reveal how extraordinary it actually is. The alpha waves, the thalamic gates closing, the muscles releasing their vigilance, the hypnagogic imagery blooming in the dark, the time distortion, the loosening of self, the quiet dissolution of the default mode network's continuous story, the hypnic jerk, ancient and surprising, and then the theta dominance, the slow eye movements, the threshold crossed. Stage N1. Sleep. What a thing. What a quiet, undervalued, scientifically astonishing thing. We hope this journey through the last 7 minutes has made your nights feel a little richer, a little more interesting, a little less something that happens to you and a little more something you understand from the inside. You're already there. You're already on the way. Let it happen. If the science felt good to you, if the last 7 minutes felt a little different after hearing about them, please consider subscribing to Deep Science Sleep. We go deep on the neuroscience of rest, consciousness, and the hidden life of the sleeping brain every day. Leave a comment below if there's a sleep science topic you'd like to explore. And if this video helped you drift off, well, we consider that a success in the most complete sense. Good night. Sleep beautifully.